Alcatraz, the Rock, 12 barren acres in the middle of San Francisco Bay. In 1934, it seemed a perfect place for an escape-proof prison for America's worst criminals. Alcatraz was America's most notorious top-security prison. Escape attempts were rare. All who had tried were caught, killed, or drowned.
This was the state-of-the-art institution of its time, sort of like the Titanic. You know, the Titanic's never going to sink. And I think everybody just figured that nobody's going to escape from Alcatraz.
But on June the 11th, 1962, 3 prisoners achieved the unimaginable. Through a series of ingenious maneuvers that took more than a year to prepare, Frank Lee Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin broke out of their cells, out of the prison, and disappeared, never to be found alive or dead. It's still a mystery whether they survived or drowned. Some say they are living. Sightings have been reported in southern Georgia, in Florida, and South America. The case is still open some 40 years later. Their story began on August the 11th, 1934, when the old military prison located on Alcatraz Island was reopened as a federal penitentiary.
Alcatraz is ready. Machine Gun Kelly, just sentenced to life imprisonment, will be among the first tenants.
They were going to put the bad, the worst there. So it was supposed to be an escape-proof facility. The men that were kept at the Alcatraz facility of the Bureau of Prisons were those who had made numerous escapes or escape attempts from other facilities.
Before long, its walls contained some of America's most notorious criminals, including Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, Nicky Cohen, and Robert Stroud, the infamous Birdman of Alcatraz.
You have to think of Alcatraz as the top of the pyramid. Alcatraz was designed to hold the biggest behavioral problems. They had killed somebody, knifed somebody, or they'd had a history of escapes. So it was really the prison for the men who had the worst behavior in other prisons.
The maximum capacity of the prison was 600, but Alcatraz rarely exceeded 250 prisoners. It boasted the highest ratio of guards to prisoners. Authorities claimed it was impossible to escape from Alcatraz.
Attempting to escape from Alcatraz, that's more or less a guy that's kind of given up on life, because this wasn't the easiest place in the world to break out of. They had one guard here to every 3 prisoners. They had 9 official standing counts, but they counted us every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day.
The newly fitted-out facility had state-of-the-art steel bars, thick concrete walls, and guards rumored to be marksmen with shoot-to-kill orders. The island was covered with fences, topped with barbed wire. Every day, there were many scheduled and unscheduled body counts and cell inspections. Then there was the bay itself. Alcatraz was an island prison. It's more than a mile to San Francisco. The water was said to be unbearably cold, the tides and currents treacherous, and there were reports of man-eating sharks. Some of this was true, and some was exaggeration designed to scare the prisoners.
Alcatraz Island has been surrounded with myths from its very inception. Some of those myths were that the water was way too cold for a man to survive the swim from Alcatraz the 1.5 miles to the mainland. This is not true. Since 1900, it had been swum regularly with no problem. There was also the myth put forth that the guards on Alcatraz were expert sharpshooters. Many of them were not sharpshooters at all. The Bureau of Prisons announced publicly that San Francisco Bay was filled with great white sharks, which of course eat human beings. There are no great white sharks in San Francisco Bay, and there never have been.
Despite this propaganda, escape attempts were made.
1,576 prisoners went through Alcatraz during its tenure as a federal prison. Of that large number of men, there were only 14 escape attempts of which we are aware, and 36 men who tried to escape. None of those men succeeded. Some died violently, some were shot to death, most were recaptured.
Some attempts were mad dashes to freedom, some involved terrible violence, some were hopelessly inept, but they all failed. Until Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin came along. Both Morris and the Anglin brothers had been in and out of jail since they were teenagers. Robert Anglin is John and Clarence's brother.
They started off as pretty young kids, I would say 8 or 10 years old. And they would pick up things in stores. I guess it would be petty larceny.
John and Clarence Anglin were always in trouble, always stealing together, always planning and organizing their burglaries.
They had to go to the reformatory school for that for maybe a couple of years. And they had broke out of one right after another. They couldn't keep them in them. Yeah.
They committed a bank robbery with a toy pistol and were caught. You don't go around robbing banks with toy pistols, you get killed. When they were caught, they threw the book at them. They wound up with 30+ years for sentences.
John William Anglin was doing his time at the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, Kansas. When he tried to escape, he was transferred to Alcatraz in the autumn of 1960. He was 30 years old. The following January, Clarence Anglin, a year younger than his brother, followed him from Leavenworth to the Rock.
Frank Morris came from a very tragic background. Mother, father abandoned him, drifted into crime, wound up in various state prisons, including Florida's.
Frank Morris was serving a 14-year sentence for bank robbery at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, when in January 1960 he was transferred to Alcatraz. In the spring of 1961, these men first hatched their plan to break out. But it was more than a year before they made their escape. The plan to break out of Alcatraz was actually made by 4 men: Frank Morris, John and Clarence Anglin, and another prisoner named Alan Clayton West. West had been in Alcatraz since June 1958 and had spent a lot of time in solitary confinement.
Alan Clayton West is an enigma in the entire escape. He is the man who claims he planned this event.
West was the key to the escape. Prisoners at Alcatraz were entitled to food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention. A prison job was a privilege to be earned. West had a job.
Alan West was a maintenance orderly, and this was a perfect position because he started out painting the cell house, which put him up on scaffolding, which put him in different cells and around the cell block, and he was able to see that there was a vent that he thought that might be vulnerable and that he could maybe get out of that ceiling vent.
While cleaning the top of this cell block in the spring of 1961, West discovered this narrow ventilator shaft to the roof. Although it was covered with bars, finding it marked the beginning of the plan. The 4 conspirators had cells near each other, West next to Morris and the Anglin brothers next to each other a few cells away.
The location of their cells on the main floor of the cell house in B block is critical to the way this escape would go down. The proximity of the cells one to another made it quite possible for them to have direct communication between themselves at any time of the day or the night.
First, West told Morris about the shaft. Morris then invited the Anglins in on the plan. It became a tale of remarkable ingenuity, patience, and luck, with necessity as the mother of their many inventions. Behind those cells was a rarely used utility corridor filled with a maze of pipes. Once they were in this narrow passageway, it was an easy matter to climb the 3 stories to the top of the cell block. From there, they hoped to escape through the narrow ventilator shaft onto the roof, and from the roof off the cell house and down to the water and off the rock. But first, they had to find a way out of their cells.
The only way they could get into the utility corridor, which was behind their cells, was to excavate, that is, make bigger, the vents that already existed in the back of each cell.
The vents were only a few inches high and wide. The grills were buried in 8-inch thick concrete. To break through, they started with simple implements, whatever they could lay their hands on. At one point, they even made crude power tools. They also had to conceal the noise of their chipping away at the concrete. One theory is that they worked while other inmates practiced their musical instruments.
Every night after dinner, the musicians were allowed to play for approximately an hour and 15 minutes. There were accordions, saxophones, trumpets, guitars. I mean, it was just a cacophony of noise.
A former prisoner, Whitey Thompson, provides another explanation. He was on the same cell block as West, Morris, and the Anglins, and says ongoing construction in the cell house also had covered the noise they were making.
The maintaining guards was knocking out a wall over an A block to make it bigger, to make it into the records office. Them jackhammers, when they're knocking out that wall, I mean, that sound was deafening. And under cover of the same noise, Morris and the England brothers were going through the backs of their cells with these little homemade chipping hammers.
Finally, after several months, they were able to squeeze their bodies through.
The excavation of the vents in the back of the cells they concealed by making fake vents out of cardboard. These vents were painted with the colors of the cells. So once the men would leave their cells at night, they could conceal their exit with this fake vent.
Well, they had to be very careful about leaving their cells. There always had to be one man watching. They simply had 2 men and 2 men, Morris and West, and the Anglin brothers, and one of them would watch while the other one would dig.
Their secret plan was widely known among the other prisoners, dozens of whom helped.
I was astounded to read in the FBI reports that maybe as many as 80 inmates out of the 160 or 180 that were still on Alcatraz knew about it.
Myself, when I was a prisoner here, anyone that attempted to escape or wanted to escape, I'd help them all I can.
That's the way a good inmate does. He helps another inmate any way he can. You know? Whether you want to go or not, if you can help him, you'll help him.
But even if the 4 prisoners could break out of the cell house, they had a much bigger problem: how to get off the island. Swimming had ended earlier escape attempts. They would need some type of boat. They found the solution in the prison library. In this issue, a popular mechanics magazine still kept in the Alcatraz archives, the men found an article explaining how to construct life jackets and an inflatable raft. They smuggled dozens of raincoats into the cell house and stitched the rubber backing together to make life jackets and a raft.
A lot of the help that they received is what you call mule work. People carrying items back and forth from industries or from the dock or from various details, hiding things, passing them on to the next person. So there was quite a bit of that going on.
They needed a place to hide these tools and a place to build their raft. Their only choice was on the top of the cell block, in plain sight of one of the guard stations. This challenge led to their most ingenious deception.
One of the most controversial aspects of this escape, and this was hidden from the general public until the early 1990s, was the fact that a part of the cell house was blocked off from view by between 40 up to as many as 80 blankets. Alan Clayton West is the one who pulled this stunt, the biggest trick of this entire escape.
West convinced the guards that to prevent dust and paint from splattering on the floors below, while he cleaned and painted the top of the cell block, he had to hang blankets.
Damn it,
Of course, the real reason to hang blankets was to conceal their work on the escape.
They were able to follow through with their escape because of the incompetence of the security. No question about it. Can you imagine being able to put up blankets on top of a cell house so that no one could see what was going on behind those blankets? Unbelievable.
The guards allowed the blankets to hang for more than 2 months. To fool the guards while they worked on top of the cell block, they constructed dummy heads to pass the nightly head counts. These are the actual heads they made, carefully preserved in the prison archives and rarely seen.
People wonder, where did they get this material to make a mask? Everything was already in that cell. You take soap, mix it into a paste. You take toilet paper and mix it into mache. Mix the concrete dust from the concrete, the dust you accumulate from under your bed, the soap and the toilet paper, combine it all together and you can make a terrific mask.
Whitey Thompson provided an essential ingredient.
I'm the artist that showed Frank Morris how to mix the color of flesh tone for them dummy heads.
To make the heads as realistic as possible, they covered them with human hair.
Clarence Anglin was working in the barber shop at this time, and he would leave at the end of the workday, returning to his cell, carrying real human hair in his pockets.
After many months of preparation, the last part of the plan, making the raft, was nearing completion. The 4 prisoners were counting the days to their breakout from Alcatraz, the inescapable prison. In early June 1962, gradually, piece by piece, the last tools and parts of the raft were smuggled into the cell block. The time to make their move was near.
If you're looking at great escapes, the Alcatraz escape was one of the best. I mean, very ingenious. They used every little tool that they could find. It really was quite a study just to see how they were able to get out of the rock, and just escaping from Alcatraz itself was quite a feat.
Completing the raft that would protect them from the icy waters of San Francisco Bay was one of the last hurdles remaining between the prisoners and freedom.
The raft measured 14 feet by 6 feet, and it was a very big raft, in other words. It was made out of between 40 and 80 raincoats that were waterproof, and it was successfully sewn down in the shops. And then it was taken to the top of B Block, where it was patiently, very painstakingly assembled over a series of weeks.
Luckily, the prison kept no inventory of their raincoats and didn't notice their disappearance. On Monday, June the 11th, 1962, Arthur Dollison, the associate warden, was on duty. His daughter, now an Alcatraz historian, remembers the day.
I was a 15-year-old kid. We had moved back to the island because my father became the associate warden. And beginning about the 1st of June, Warden Blackwell went on a vacation. And my father became the acting warden, and he was still acting warden when Morris and the Anglins left. And the night of the escape, we were all watching television down in our apartment on the island.
After lights out at 9:30 p.m., the 4 prisoners began their escape.
They're in their cells. They've got to get everything organized. They've got to get through those openings. They've got to get up to the top of the cell house. Then they've got to literally punch that ventilator out.
Each man set his dummy head in place and propped up his blankets to resemble a sleeping body. One last time they squeezed out of the back of their cells. One last time they set their fake grills in the holes behind them.
I knew they were going that night. Well, the word was out, they should be going that night, and we were listening for it. I can hear them working their way out into the tunnel that's in between the cell blocks.
They met in the utility corridor and began their climb to the top of the cell block. But only 3 men were in the narrow passageway, Alan West was struggling to break out of the back of his cell.
He couldn't get through his opening. There was a steel bar that he hadn't anticipated.
West had never fully excavated the vent hole.
I could hear him going up, climbing on the plumbing towards the ceiling of the cell block. And while they were going up, one of them dropped the bar. I heard it fall, cling, clang, bang, hitting all them pipes as it fell all the ways down. And when you've been in prison a long time, you get to know every single sound in prison. We heard that bar fall. It just jumped right out. And the moment it fell and I could hear it, I looked over to the gun rail at the guard over there, and he didn't bat an eye. I know he heard that sound, but he didn't bat an eye.
Whitey is not the only one to question that the guards knew about the escape and did nothing to stop it.
When we went out there to visit Alcatraz, they showed us the route they took, you know, in between the walls where all the plumbing was. And I don't know how they could do all of that without, you know, somebody hearing it, the noise.
They met on top of the cell block, where the hanging blanket still hid them while they completed the raft.
The Anglin brothers were finishing up the raft because the top of the cell block was the only place where you could actually make a raft because it was big and it needed a big space to build. So they were all working up there until the last minute.
Meanwhile, West worked furiously to free himself, but time was running out. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers couldn't afford to wait. They had to leave West behind.
They had always known, and they had always said among themselves, if you're not ready to go, we're going. So, you know, it's every man for himself in a way.
Slowly, quietly, they worked on the old rusted bars, finally removing them from the vent. Then they squeezed through the hole.
Once they got up on the roof, I could hear the muffled sound of them going across that roof, like a muffled sound, almost like a little vibration, but you could feel it and as well as hear them going across that roof. And as they went across the roof, every night on Alcatraz, hundreds of seagulls settled down on that roof. And when they went across that roof, these seagulls took off. They're squawking and they're raising hell up there. I don't know how these guys couldn't help but hear it.
The three men sped across the 300-foot roof and climbed down the 5-story building. Once on the ground, they cut their way through 2 8-foot fences topped with barbed wire and made their way past the water tower and down a grassy hill, all unseen by the guards in their towers.
And there was found an imprint of a raft measuring 14 feet by 6 feet, and the men had obviously gotten in this raft and gotten off the island.
Eventually, West was able to break out of his cell. He scrambled through the ventilator shaft onto the roof, but he was too late. The others had gone. The man who came up with the original escape plan waited on the roof until dawn, when he returned to his cell in despair.
Around 7 o'clock in the morning, the wake-up bell rang, and everybody, all the inmates got up. They had about 10 minutes to wash up and go to the bathroom and have a cigarette, and then there's a whistle. The lieutenant blows a whistle, and all the inmates stand at the bars, and that's called the first stand-up count of the day. Well, obviously, the dummies didn't stand up.
Morris!
When neither Anglin brother nor Frank Morris stood up in their cells, the guards had to investigate.
He stuck his hand in there to push one of their heads to wake him up.
Get up!
And the head rolled over on the floor. The guard jumped out quite a ways when that head rolled on the floor.
Arthur Dollison, acting warden, got the call. His daughter speaks of that morning.
There was a phone call that came to my house, and my dad told me later that he reached to the phone with dread because he just had a bad feeling. And when he picked up the phone, they said, "We've got 3 dummies in the cell house." And they meant that literally. And He rushed out of the house. And then the next thing that happened is that there was a siren.
The alarm could be heard everywhere on Alcatraz Island. Once the acting warden arrived, the investigation began immediately. Because of the hole in the back of West's cell, the questioning began with him.
Alan West had to acknowledge that he was part of it because there was this huge opening in the back of his cell. And so, of course, he was brought in and he appeared to cooperate. I mean, there was nothing else he could do. He provided some details and he did not provide certain details. He told them what was safe to tell them and that would not jeopardize the chances of the others.
Dozens of Alcatraz guards searched the island from top to bottom, from the cell house and prison roof to the power station and workshops. They combed the grounds under the water tower and all along the shoreline. They circled the island to look for bodies and to check the numerous waterline caves where men could hide. While the guards hunted, the other prisoners were held in their cells, waiting to be interrogated.
They talked to all those guys. You couldn't get no one to talk on Alcatraz. None of these guys would ever talk.
At the same time, the dragnet was rapidly expanding.
The search was supposedly one of the largest manhunts since the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. And it was an air, land, and sea search. The Coast Guard put out 3 cutters and aircraft. All the local police, the FBI, of course, were called.
When the federal agents arrived, they were amazed at what they found.
The first questions that arose is, what the dickens are those blankets doing up there on top of B Block?
But what the FBI found behind the blankets was even more shocking.
It literally looks like a hardware store up there. Every sort of a tool that you could imagine had either been constructed or literally stolen from the shops or elsewhere on the prison. All the detritus necessary for a very carefully planned and complicated escape.
These tools are the actual ones the prisoners used. They're held in the prison archives and are rarely seen. In addition to all this equipment, the search turned up some clues to help piece together the true story.
Well, we know that the men actually built 2 rafts. One of them was found, apparently left behind for Alan Clayton West. It was a smaller raft. It was not so well built.
There was a life preserver left on top of the cell block. There was a paddle left on top of the roof. The life preserver that was found on top of the cell block was West's. They did not need a 4th life preserver. So they left that behind for West in case he got out.
The investigators doubted the 3 men could make it ashore on a flimsy raft made of old raincoats. However, as no bodies were found, the FBI operated on the assumption that the prisoners did in fact make it to land. Word of the escape was quickly picked up by the press. It was a very big story, and hundreds of leads poured in.
I remember the national press that was involved in this, the big FBI manhunt. Their pictures were all over every single paper, probably around the world.
2 days after the escape, the search uncovered something in San Francisco Bay.
The first thing that was found was a paddle. It was floating between Angel Island and Alcatraz. And it was matched to a paddle that had been left behind on top of the block, so they could prove that it was a homemade Alcatraz paddle.
The next day, the crew of an Army debris boat discovered an important clue in the waters just off Angel Island, more than a mile from Alcatraz.
The second thing that was found about 2 days later was a packet of photographs. Now, it was actually in about 3 feet of water. It was made of the same raincoat material as the life preserver on top of the block. And when they opened it up, they found about 88 photographs, many of which were identified on the back as being an Anglin family member.
Included in the packet were 9 slips of paper with names and addresses of friends and family. The FBI believed the fugitives would never have left this behind. They decided that the raft must have sunk and the fugitives drowned. But not everyone agreed.
Back then, when they found their photographs, the family photographs in the water, I figured then that they had drowned. But, of course, again, you never know. They could do that to throw them off their trail.
Members of the Anglin family believe the 3 escaping men made it across the bay alive.
We had sent them pictures of different members of the family. They had them in a little plastic bag. And they let go of that stuff probably to throw the law off. The law finally said, you know, well, they wouldn't depart from something like that. Well, that didn't mean nothing to them. They wanted to get away. I think they made it.
Over the next few weeks, more confusing clues were found.
1, then 2, then 3 of the life jackets the men were wearing on the night of their escape floated and appeared in San Francisco Bay. One of them just off the shore of Alcatraz Island, one of them out beyond the Golden Gate Bridge, and another one closer to Angel Island.
But their big raft was never found, nor were their bodies. The FBI then turned their attention to the fugitives' families, especially the large southern family of John and Clarence Anglin.
It has been my experience and the experience of everybody that works this kind of work that these people that escape always maintain some type of contact with their family.
The Bureau began surveillance of the Anglin family members, most of whom lived in Ruskin, Florida, a fishing community on Tampa Bay near the Gulf of Mexico.
They were pretty often coming out to our house to talk to different members of the family. Had we seen them, had we heard from them, and hundreds of more questions. The mail had been watched, you know, also for a number of years probably by the FBI, thinking that they might make some kind of contact with us, you know.
For 15 years, the FBI searched for Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin, chasing leads in America and abroad. They continued to watch family members. Nothing of significance ever turned up. 15 years after the Anglin brothers and Frank Morris escaped from Alcatraz, the FBI still had not found them or their bodies. In 1977, the U.S. Marshals took over the search.
One of our significant core missions in the Marshal Service is our Fugitive Apprehension Program. And that basically is we look for individuals that are wanted by the federal court. Those that have escaped, that's our bread and butter, that's what we've been doing for years now.
But could men like these really avoid capture for 40 years and disappear without a trace?
Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had such a criminal history going back to their childhood, and many, many escapes and escape attempts. They got in and out of trouble of all kinds of reasons during their entire lives. So the question has always arisen in my mind, could these 3 individuals get away and stay out of trouble for all these many years since then?
Once you escape from Alcatraz, you go underground, and that's it for the rest of your life. You simply become part of the woodwork. You're ordinary.
Sightings of the fugitives and leads to their whereabouts trickle in to this day.
A lot of phone calls, a lot of leads. Some were good and some were the typical one where I just saw somebody who looks like him in a 7-Eleven. Or I saw somebody passing me by in a vehicle, but there were a couple, 2 or 3 real good ones that we ended up following up. This mystery has hung around for 38 years, and people being as they are, they cheer for the underdog, and I'm sure a lot of people think, are wishing and hoping that they did make it out, and we're just wishing and hoping that we will find the answer to that question.
Many believe the raft deflated and the convicts had to swim for their lives.
They were old, Navy issue, raincoats. I have to think that the raft started to break up almost immediately, and they started to sink, and they were forced to put on their life jackets, and they were fighting cold, cold water with all of their clothes on.
The government's position is that the escaping prisoners probably drowned in the bay, but others argue they have no hard evidence of this.
The Bureau of Prisons, to this day, will tell you that they drowned. But there's no proof that they drowned. Police officers will admit that anytime there's a drowning, those corpses usually wind up on the shores. For 3 to not wash up anywhere tells me they definitely made it.
My belief is that somebody was waiting out in the water in a boat, and I believe that they made their escape that way. The raft was never found, and I would go back to the fact that the raft having never been found, along with no body's been found, that raft was taken on the boat that met them and picked them up.
This theory maintains that a boat was arranged by another prisoner at Alcatraz, a former mob boss from Harlem, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson.
Bumpy Johnson was the type of guy that would have helped any way he could. He was that type of person. He was anti-police, anti-establishment. Bumpy Johnson had connections. If Bumpy did that, then I would say, yeah, they got away.
It was illegal for a non-authorized boat to get within several hundred yards of Alcatraz. However, official police records confirm that there was a boat between Alcatraz and Angel Island on the night of the escape.
There is some official evidence to suggest that a boat was out there. Robert Cecchi was a San Francisco policeman on duty that night, and he would report later to his supervisor that he did see at 1 o'clock in the morning a boat standing silent off the shore of Alcatraz. After a period of time, its motors were re-engaged, the lights came back on, and the boat went right out sailing through the Golden Gate and disappeared.
The authorities believe that if the fugitives survived, it's likely they fled the country, first to Mexico and then possibly to South America.
These men had studied Spanish while they were in prison during the course of the 9 months they planned this escape. The men did plan from the very beginning to escape down to South America, where they figured they would be fairly secure from discovery.
A search of Alan West's cell turned up a map of Mexico torn out of a road atlas.
The question has been asked many times about just where did these 3 individuals go after they escaped. Brazil would be one of those countries that you could go to and there's no extradition. A lot of criminals who have gone to Brazil to escape American authorities in the past.
The marshals had good reason to suspect that this is exactly what Morris and the Anglins did.
Another individual out in Texas came up with information that her grandfather had pointed out to her one of the individuals who had escaped successfully from Alcatraz and was looking for paperwork to get out into a foreign country.
One of the most promising leads involved a former friend of the Anglin brothers who reported seeing them in Brazil in 1975. Art Roderick was directly involved in the investigation and interviewed the informant himself.
This one seemed to be pretty good based on the fact that he had known them previously and wasn't just identifying them off, the pictures that we had. So those are always the best leads, friends or family members.
There was a lead that was chased down in Brazil. We were told again by a tipster that they had in fact seen these individuals at a bar in Brazil. We pursued that to the point where a deputy did in fact go to Brazil and find this bar and did some interviews down there without any results.
In 1989, a promising lead started one of the most peculiar escapades in the continuing manhunt. The informant was a woman the authorities called Kathy.
There were anonymous tips called in, and one of those was forwarded to our office here in Tallahassee. It was with a description of where a house and a trailer located outside of Marianna, Florida, was located. That there were 2 people living there that was believed to be Anglin and possibly Frank Morris.
Marianna is in northern Florida, near the Georgia and Alabama state lines. For several weeks, U.S. Marshal Mac McClendon drove around back roads hunting for the fugitives.
That lead led us through half the county, and we did not find the place we were looking for. The individual who provided these anonymous tips had knowledge that most people would not know unless they were familiar with the case, familiar with the Anglin brothers.
In spite of all the tip-offs and searching, they have never found the fugitives. Some cite a great deal of circumstantial evidence suggesting the fugitives survived. Over the years, the Anglin family has received numerous unexplained letters and postcards, especially at birthdays and holidays. And every Mother's Day until her death, John and Clarence's mother received flowers from an anonymous source.
There have been other incidences, mysterious telephone calls that have persisted from 1962 all the way to this very day.
And then there's the story of the funerals of the Anglin parents. These may just be rumors, but they're widely told and believed. In 1973, their mother died.
We know that at the funeral for Rachel Anglin, the mother of the two Anglin brothers, we know the FBI was there attending this service, and we know that two tall women, unusual looking and very tall, showed up. They were in long dresses, heavy makeup, said not a word to anyone, and disappeared long before any of the FBI agents who were there at this same service could question them.
If Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were still alive today, what would they look like? The History Channel asked the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to use its unique computerized age enhancement process to see how the famous fugitives might look today. Art Roderick, the U.S. Marshal's Chief of Investigative Operations, has hunted these men for many years and helped the engineer. The computer technician copies aged facial features and pastes them into the new profile to suggest how the men would appear now.
So what you have is like a file in there with a bunch of noses, and you pick the one that's closest to the original mugshot of Frank Morris.
Right.
And then pull it up and then, okay.
Morris was 35 years old at the time of the escape and would now be in his early 70s. It's startling to watch John Anglin age from his early 30s to his late 60s. Clarence Anglin's image goes through a similar transformation. This is what he might look like if he was still alive today.
Hopefully, this will assist you guys in your efforts to try to locate these three escapees.
Looks fantastic. It'll definitely generate some phone calls.
After some 4 decades, there's still no consensus regarding the fate of these famous fugitives.
It's difficult to speculate, and I hate to say that they didn't make it, because as soon as I say that, sure enough, they'll turn up a week later. But more than likely, I don't think they made it out of the water, so to the other side.
For those people who insist they drown, I respond by saying they haven't done their homework. They don't know what these boys were really like. They were not going to drown.
Personally, I think their bones are still out in that bay. I'd love to sit here and tell you that they made it. I knew these guys. I'd love to tell you that, but if I did, I'd be lying to you.
Only months after their 1962 escape, Attorney General Robert Kennedy announced the closure of the prison on Alcatraz Island. The remaining inmates were transferred to other institutions. Now Alcatraz, the escape-proof prison, stands empty in San Francisco Bay and has become a tourist attraction.